Unless you've been sleeping under a rock for the past week, in which case I'm jealous. You know that last week's US presidential election was a pretty devastating defeat for Democrats. Vice President Kamala Harris failed to beat former President Donald J. Trump, with the Republican even winning the popular vote for the very first time, despite his campaign being even more openly racist, more fascistic, more deranged than the past two. The Harris campaign also failed to energize the Democratic base in the way that Biden did in 2020. Turnout was down, and Gaza pissed off a lot of young voters and people of color, especially in swing states like Michigan. In the Senate, Democrats lost their razor-thin 51-49 majority, meaning that Trump will have absolutely no problem passing what he wants, and especially confirming even more far-right judges, aka the same kind of judges who threw out his Mar-a-Lago case, overturned Roe v. Wade, and gave him immunity from prosecution for anything he does as president. Joining me now to discuss what this all means for 2025 and beyond is one of the Senate's more progressive Democratic members, Chris Van Hollen of Maryland. Senator, thank you for coming on Mehdi Unfiltered.
Great to be with you.
It's been exactly 1 week since Election Day. Just starting with, how are you feeling? How are you and your Senate Democratic colleagues feeling, having lost the White House and lost control of your chamber?
Well, I'm scared for the country. This was a shellacking, and we are still digging through the rubble right now. Clearly, the Democrats were on the wrong side of a change election, and so I think we need to take a very deep look at what went wrong. And this is a moment where everyone's got their own narrative that usually reflects their pre-existing views about the election. So I think it's really careful that we step back. We listen to voters very carefully. This is not my view, it's sort of a tactical question. There's some fundamental issues here. But I don't want to jump to any one conclusion.
And I'll come to that in a moment. Just, you mentioned change election. For me, the moment, and I guess there are many moments where she lost, or, history will judge. But for me, a moment where at the time I thought she could lose because of this was when Harris goes on The View and she's asked, would you do anything different to Joe Biden? What would you have done differently? And she couldn't answer. She said nothing. I think that's a bad thing to say in a change election.
I think that's true. I think given that she was the vice president of the United States, given the short turnaround, I don't think, sure, she could have come up with a few small things, but in terms of the fundamentals here, my view is that was a really tough position for her to be in. So it really does raise the questions about what we might have done even earlier in the process.
On the fundamentals, many of your colleagues in the Senate have been quite vocal on why they think the Democrats failed. Bernie Sanders said last week that the Democratic Party has, quote, abandoned working class people, and they have abandoned the Democrats in return. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut tweeted over the weekend that your side, quote, never fully grappled with the wreckage of 50 years of neoliberalism, which has left legions of Americans adrift. Do you agree with them that Democrats have fallen out of touch with working class people? They've alienated working class people? Because the counter argument, of course, as you know, is that Joe Biden was the most pro-worker president since LBJ. He walked a picket line. Where do you stand on this?
So I think both things can be true. I think the answer is yes. Clearly, we've lost touch with working class Americans. All you have to do is look at the results, right, to reach that conclusion. That's what the voters are telling us. It's also true that Joe Biden's policies and his walking on the picket line and all of the legislation that we passed was designed to help more, not just middle-class Americans, but working-class people trying to work their way into the middle class. Clearly, people didn't feel it. People felt alienated, and Trump somehow was able to grab that sort of change election feeling, like the system's broken, and I agree with that. They saw Trump somehow is the answer to a broken system. Democrats, who've been saying for a long time we need to do more to break an unfair system that helps the wealthy and the very,
it just didn't cut through.
It did not cut through. And I think there are economic messages here. I think part of this was the cultural messages. Democrats need to stick up for civil rights and all those really fundamental values that we stand for. We need to do it in a way that brings others along with us. And there was a lot of evidence that people just saw, Democrats as trying to ram certain things down people's throats as opposed to try to bring them along.
It's interesting you say bringing people along. One of the strategies of the Harris campaign was to try and bring along never Trump Republicans. Nikki Haley voters in swing states was the plan. Rolling Stone magazine reports that there were several Democratic Party operatives begging the Harris campaign to not campaign with Liz Cheney in the way that she did, to not tout the endorsement of Dick Cheney, the Prince of Darkness. And, you know, a lot of those Republican women didn't turn out for Harris, which was the plan. Do you agree with those operatives that campaigning with Liz Cheney, of all people, in a change election when Gaza's on the ballot was a mistake?
Well, I don't think it was determinative. That said, Mehdi, I think touting the endorsement of Dick Cheney specifically was a mistake. I mean, Trump was running as the candidate who was going to keep us out of war, and yet she touted, you know, the endorsement of Dick Cheney, who was the big proponent of going into Iraq, which was a big mistake from the beginning. So, right, and she did it in Michigan. And so, yes, I think these are mistakes. I don't think they're determinative mistakes with respect to the outcome.
You would have wished she didn't do them.
I wish she hadn't, especially. I understand the Liz Cheney, because Liz Cheney stood up for democracy, right, and after the January 6th. But touting, for example, Dick Cheney's endorsement, in my view, was a dissonant message.
On Gaza, you, of course, have been quite outspoken amongst Democrats when it comes to Gaza. You've urged President Biden to adopt a plan to recognize Palestine as a state. You've accused Israel in Gaza of committing, quote, textbook war crimes at a time when a lot of your fellow Democrats don't want to touch this issue with a 10-foot barge pole. You've criticized the Biden administration for failing to uphold international humanitarian law, many would say American law. Why do you think it was that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris could not bring themselves to break with Israel, to break with Netanyahu, even as they themselves were conceding that Netanyahu wants Trump to win? This was hurting them electorally. They were being told in places like Michigan it was hurting them. And yet they couldn't budge. They couldn't even do what Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi did, which was mildly criticize Netanyahu, talk about the possibility of a weapons embargo.
Yeah. So the first thing I should say is I do not view this issue through the political lens, right? People will talk about it in terms of Michigan or elsewhere. My view is our policy should be guided about what's best for U.S. values and U.S. interests.
And I want to come to that.
Yeah. And
but on the electoral side, why couldn't they break with? Why couldn't they do what was obvious to happen?
I think it goes to the deeper issue. Why couldn't they just do what was right for American values and American interests? Because if you could do that, the politics, in my view, whatever they were, would flow from that. And I'm not sure that it's absolutely clear in aspects. And so that is why.
You don't think Gaza cost you Michigan?
I'm not sure. I did see very interesting results of, Congresswoman Rashid Tlaib's district, where she won with like 75%, and Donald Trump won. So no doubt in that district this was an issue. Whether it was statewide, I don't know. Okay. And certainly I don't think nationally. I will say though, Mehdi, I will say young people around the country, this was certainly an issue. I just don't think it was the determinative issue. I think it would be overreading the results.
On the values, let me re-ask the question. Why can't they break with Israel, if not for domestic electoral political gain, then for moral and legal reasons, for our values of the US that we claim to uphold? Why are we supporting the mass killing of children in Gaza?
This is a deeply frustrating question because I have, as you said, pushed the president to do a lot more. He's essentially given Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the super right-wing racist government of people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich a blank check, right? Biden says we need more aid into Gaza. They say, no, maybe a little trickle more. Biden says sends more bombs. He says, end the indiscriminate bombing. That's a Joe Biden quote. Doesn't happen, sends more bombs. I think this is going to be a stain on Biden's otherwise successful foreign policy agenda. He has essentially been played by Netanyahu from day one. And every time the President of the United States says, this is what we, the United States, think is in our interests, please do it, He gets the back of the hand from Netanyahu and refuses to take any action, right?
Refuses to withhold. Are you slightly infantilizing an 82-year-old man and saying he got played? Isn't the counter-argument, he didn't get played. He supports this stuff. He says he's a Zionist to his core. He says, I'll never split with Israel. Even now, the election's done. Even if he was worried about the election. The election's over. He's got 2 months of lame duck presidency. He can say and do what he wants. Even now, he will not budge on Israel. You are aware, I'm sure, I think you've brought with you the letter. Yeah. The United States, Biden and Blinken, told Israel 30 days ago to boost aid into Gaza. Otherwise, we won't give you the same amount of bombs as we have before. Today is the 30th day, the day we are speaking on. The UN says Israel has missed that deadline. Every humanitarian aid group says Israel has missed that deadline. I think they wanted something like 350 trucks. It's been an average of 50 or 60 trucks, if that, in the month of October. And the Biden administration said today, no, we're not going to go through with that. What we said we'd do after 30 days, we're not going to do.
Yeah. So all I can say is that President Biden's inaction, given the suffering in Gaza, is shameful. I mean, there's no other word for it. And if you look at the letter that Secretaries Austin and Blinken sent on October 13th, they lay out all the criteria against which they're going to measure whether there's more humanitarian aid getting in. Almost none of them have been met. Maybe a teeny little thing that they're pointing to now. They also say, by the way, Knesset, don't pass the 2 bills banning UNRWA. Don't do it.
They did it.
They also say in this letter, ICRC should get access to prisoners. So what happens after the letter goes out? Israel passes the 2 bills, effectively shutting down UNRWA, and they have still taken no action on the ICRC. And still the administration says, oh, it's okay. So look, if the president, if he doesn't mean what he says, then he should stop saying it, because he looks so weak. The whole administration looks weak when they say to Netanyahu, don't do this, don't do that. This is against our values. This is against our interests. And then when they do it, does nothing. This is the problem.
I'm going to ask you a very straight question. Yeah. When Blinken and Austin wrote that letter on behalf of the president, were they lying? Were they lying when they said, we will take... Do you believe the day they wrote that letter, they said to themselves, in 30 days, we're going to crack down? They knew when they sent that letter they were never going to do it.
Let me say this. In the light of what happened just today, where they said this is a green light, after just a few days ago, the State Department spokesman saying that, the Netanyahu government gets an F for lack of progress. Days after Cindy McCain, right, who's no lefty, says,
widow of John McCain.
Yeah, it says, quote, this is... The unacceptable is confirmed. Famine is likely happening or imminent in North Gaza, right? Given all that data, looking back, my concern is this was a political attempt to try to send a message to voters a month ago that, oh, the president really does care about the situation, the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Senator, what you're saying is pretty stark.
No, in light of today's decision, where none of the criteria that they laid out, with one possible teeny exception, where we haven't really seen it, and they go ahead and say, okay, we really didn't mean this letter, 30 days ago? That's what they're saying.
But what does that say about the leadership of your party, that you, a prominent senator of the Democratic Party, are saying today that when they put that letter out, it was domestic politics, it was electioneering. They didn't actually care about starving kids in Gaza.
Look, this is the only way I can interpret it in light of today's decision, where everything that's going wrong in northern Gaza, given everything all the international humanitarian organizations are saying, given what Cindy McCain is saying, given what Kathy Russell, who's the head of UNICEF, is saying, that the fact of that they refuse to take any action to hold the Netanyahu government accountable does call into question exactly what their purpose was in sending this letter.
In northern Gaza right now, famine, people being driven from their homes. I was with Omer Bartov last night, who is professor of Holocaust studies at Brown University, an Israeli-American academic, one of the world's leading scholars on genocide. He said, I didn't think this was a genocide. I resisted saying the G word. But what's happening in northern Gaza is undeniably a genocide. Do you agree with him?
I don't know the answer to that, Mehdi. And look, you're going to have a lot of scholars. Even the ICJ decision was a preliminary decision. They're looking at it. Others are. Here's what I would say. And it's interesting that Haaretz, which as you and I know is an Israeli newspaper, their editorial came out saying what's happening in northern Gaza is ethnic cleansing. And it does seem pretty clear that that's what's going on if you listen to the people like the Smotriches and the Ben-Gvirs. So
what does that say? I mean, I'm listening to you say this, I'm glad you're saying this, but what does it say about the Democratic Party? What does it say about the United States that we're supporting ethnic cleansing?
This is an incredible stain on the Biden administration and on the president himself as he takes inaction despite all that we are witnessing. Of course, you know, the Israeli government's not allowing international press into Gaza. You know, they don't want people reporting on it, but nevertheless, in this age, we can see the videos coming out. We can see the testimony. So all I can say, I'm not going to try to justify the lack of action. As I say, it's absolutely unacceptable, and it should change.
Do you think, as Trump comes into office, appoints Mike Huckabee today as ambassador to Israel, Rubio as Secretary of State, is going to allow Netanyahu to get away with even more crimes, presumably? Do you think we're going to see more of your colleagues now speaking out on Gaza, which I would welcome, but on the other hand, a little bit sad if suddenly Democrats find a spine to speak out on this because Trump's doing it, not Biden?
Look, going back to the issue of values and interests over politics, I hope people will watch what's happening and finally start to speak out more. I mean, a number of my colleagues have. I want to applaud them. But yes, people need to be really focused on this. What I worry most about the Trump administration coming in is not only the Gaza situation. I mean, again, because of the lack of action by President Biden and others, Gaza is a wasteland. What I worry about now is what Smotrich said just the other day, which is they want to move full bore in terms of more settlements on the West Bank, continuing to push Palestinians off their land, emboldening the extremist settlers. And in that small area, President Biden as a candidate promised he was actually going to take on these issues in a meaningful way. He didn't, but they did finally, have this executive order to go after extremist settlers. What I worry about is the Trump administration essentially giving an absolute green light to that policy. And if you look at people like Huckabee, I worry a lot.
In terms of Trump and his presidency, domestically, what's top of your list of concerns? What are you most worried about on January 20th, 2025?
Well, it's a very long list.
Yes.
Obviously, I'm interested in him, weaponizing the Justice Department and going after his, quote, enemies. I'm also very worried about his attack on the merit-based civil service, right? These are the men and women who go to work regardless who's president. They have experience, they're dedicated, they understand that their job is to carry out the policies of the executive branch. But what Trump wants to do is replace people with experience and qualifications with political cronies who will do his political bidding. And I just hope every American will look at this, because the fact that we have a professional merit-based civil service is a great asset for the country, for the United States. If you look at countries around the world where you have authoritarian leaders, one of the biggest openings to corruption is the fact that they don't have professional civil service. It's a crony-based operation.
You are clearly someone who sees Trump as a threat to democracy, as an authoritarian.
I do, based on everything he said.
And so do I. And I was happy to hear Kamala Harris and Joe Biden refer to his threat to democracy. Harris called him a fascist. And yet now I hear them say, we welcome his victory. We congratulate his victory. America chose a different vision. We hope all the transition's great. We're going to meet him at the White House. A lot of people are saying, did they really mean it? Sounds like they just think he's another normal candidate for the presidency.
Certainly not a normal candidate, certainly not a normal president. I think on this issue, what they were saying is that unlike Trump, we are going to respect the peaceful transfer of power.
They don't have to respect him.
No, that's you don't certainly have to respect what he stands for.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, outgoing Senate Majority Chuck Schumer, said on Twitter that the only way to get things done in the Senate is through bipartisan legislation. The next 2 years will be no different. Republicans, colleagues of yours, did not vote for anything. The infrastructure, but the major stuff they did not vote on. They've become even more radicalized, the people they've brought to the Senate. And I look at someone like Chuck Schumer, and I want to play a clip to you from Chuck Schumer. I think we've got a clip that you can hear. This is during the 2016 election. Have a listen to what Chuck Schumer said.
For every blue-collar Democrat we will lose in Western PA, we will pick up 2, 3 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia.
I mean, that was a strategy that basically said, ignore the fact that we're hemorrhaging working class votes, we'll do very well in the suburbs. It didn't work in 2016. It certainly hasn't worked in 2024.
Well, that particular statement obviously did not age well. I think everybody, including Chuck Schumer, would agree that we need to do a lot more to connect with working class voters.
Should Chuck Schumer resign?
No, I don't think he should.
He just
resign.
Lost a Senate majority. Shouldn't a leader step down after they lose a majority?
You know, I will say, having chaired the DSCC this cycle 6 years ago, I know how tough it is. The other way to look at it is when your presidential candidate loses, it's very, very difficult in this politically polarized environment for Senate candidates to actually prevail. And we have 4 of them who have so far. We're still waiting, obviously, on Pennsylvania. But if you look at what happened in Michigan, if you look at what happened in Nevada, if you look at what happened in Arizona and Wisconsin, those are all states that Trump won, where our Senate candidates won.
Should Justice Sonia Sotomayor retire from the Supreme Court between now and January the 20th to give Joe Biden and Senate Democrats a chance of replacing her so Trump is not the one who replaces her?
No, I don't think so. Number one, I have no reason to believe she's in that ill health. Number two, she's been a great Supreme Court justice.
Agreed.
And it's our job to make sure that 4 years from now, we have a Democratic president and that we can then decide on future vacancies to the Supreme
Given
Court.
RBG, you want to take
No,
that risk?
I really don't see this in the
4 years
category
is a
based
long
on what I
time.
know. 4 years is a long time, but
Okay.
I have no reason to believe, and I think she would be the first, if she was in that kind of, ill health, to let people know that
She wouldn't do an RBG, you're saying. She would be smart enough
Look,
not to
I don't
stick to
know all the background on RBG,
we know
but
that.
yes, that was obviously something that was a big concern. Right?
Last question.
Yeah.
You mentioned good news from the election. Senators on the Democratic side winning seats that perhaps people thought they wouldn't win. Angela Alsobrooks made history in your state last week after being elected Maryland's first black U.S. senator. What does that mean to your constituents, given they also saw a black woman just fail to win the presidency, and a woman also? America has no woman president still, almost uniquely amongst major Western countries. What does it mean for Maryland?
Well, first of all, Maryland was a bright spot. If the rest of the country had done what Maryland did in this election, both in terms of electing Kamala Harris, our 10 electoral votes, plus Angela Alsobrooks. So, I think Maryland, we call ourselves American in miniature. Obviously, in this sense, politically, we were not this cycle.
Yeah.
But let's end on an upbeat note here, because this was a very important election, I think, in Maryland. Angela Alsobrooks is going to be a great senator. And I will point out that in the Democratic primary, she overcame over $65 million spent against her by her opponent in the primary, Democratic opponent. So I did take that was a bit of a renewal of faith in the system, that money cannot always win. She was outspent big time. She prevailed in the primary. She came in big. She beat a former, two-term Republican governor from Maryland, Larry Hogan.
Yeah.
So Maryland is a bright spot. Look, we've got losing both houses in the White House is obviously the worst case scenario. So we're going to have to fight like hell to protect our values. I think what some are talking about, there's some things like protecting the Chesapeake Bay, right, the state of Maryland. Even during the Trump years, we were able to work with our colleagues on the Republican side to fund the Chesapeake Bay. The Trump budget, when he first came in 2017, zero for the Chesapeake Bay Protection Program. It was $73 million. We got it up over $90 million, even while Trump was in the White House. So there are things you can do, but on some of these big fundamental questions, you're absolutely right. It's going to be very, very difficult to get a lot done in this particular political environment.
I thought we were going to end on an upbeat note. Senator Chris Van Hollen.
We'll still get some of those.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to Zeteo.com. Your support matters.